It was a quiet afternoon when the encounter began, something that would, within minutes, spiral into a moment that would change lives, ignite outrage, and spark conversations across the nation. On one side was Officer James Carter, a man who'd spent years on the force, trusted to uphold the law. On the other, a black citizen, a man whose name we may never fully know outside this story, but whose experience would resonate with thousands of others whose voices often go unheard. It started as most routine traffic stops do, or so it seemed. The officer pulled over the driver, a seemingly standard interaction, questions about registration, a check of the license, and a quick back and forth that should have ended with a warning or maybe even just a ticket. But for reasons still unclear, something shifted. The tension in the air thickened. The officer's voice became sharper, his stance more aggressive. And the driver, who, up until that moment, had been calm, composed, even respectful, started to feel the heat of a growing conflict. What we don't always see is what happens when the camera is turned off, when the badge is just a symbol, and when emotions take over. In the silence between words, there's a growing sense of discomfort, an instinct that something isn't quite right. Was it the officer's demeanor? The way he was positioning himself, his hand hovering near his weapon as if anticipating a fight? Or was it something deeper, something embedded in the system that often places black men in a position where they are viewed as a threat, no matter how peaceful their actions? As the seconds ticked by, the situation escalated. The driver, clearly frustrated but trying to maintain composure, questioned the officer's authority, his orders, and the way the interaction was turning out. The officer, feeling challenged, responded with force, his words sharp, his movements swift, and before anyone knew it, the situation was no longer about a simple traffic violation. It was about control, about power, and about the dynamic that plays out every day in this country between law enforcement and the communities they are meant to protect. What happens next would be hard to believe if it weren't for the grainy footage, the camera shaking as the scene unfolds. The driver, now on the ground, trying to defend himself, calling out for help. The officer, towering over him, using force to subdue him, ignoring the cries for mercy. It was a moment of sheer imbalance, a stark reminder of how fragile a person's safety can be when it's threatened by those sworn to protect them. As the camera zoomed out and the sirens began to blare, a crowd started to form, some shouting for justice, others just in shock. The officer, meanwhile, was still there, his presence unshaken, but now the audience had grown. People were watching. People were asking questions. What had led to this? How had a routine stop escalated into something that felt so much more sinister? The questions are still there, lingering. Why did Officer Carter react the way he did? What was it about this moment that triggered such force? And what does this say about the broader issues facing communities of color when it comes to interactions with police officers? This is just the beginning of the story. The events we're about to dive into aren't just about one officer or one citizen. They're about a larger system, one that many believe is broken. The underlying tension, the unspoken fear, the question of power. These are all themes that echo through every corner of our society. How many more times have moments like this gone unnoticed? How many more people are quietly suffering under the weight of excessive force, only to find that their stories are buried before they even have a chance to be heard? Stay with me as we break down what happened that day, the events that led up to it, the questions that followed, and the aftermath that many don't want to confront. It's time to look at the truth, even if it's uncomfortable, because this story, while deeply personal, is a story that belongs to all of us, and it's not over yet. The moments that followed the initial interaction are still unclear to those who weren't there, but for those who witnessed it, they can still remember the sick feeling in their stomachs, the knots that seemed to tighten the longer the scene unfolded. As the driver sat in his car, the routine nature of the stop seemed almost mundane. He had nothing to hide. His hands rested on the steering wheel, and his voice, though quiet, was polite. He knew the rules. He knew how to comply. But compliance, it seemed, wasn't enough to guarantee safety. Officer Carter had been on the force for 8 years. He knew the protocols, the training, the steps to take in any given situation. He had faced countless routine traffic stops. But this one felt different from the start. Maybe it was the way the driver looked at him when he approached the vehicle, his eyes wide, his posture tense, as if already anticipating something was going to go wrong. Or maybe it was the neighborhood, a place where the tension between law enforcement and the residents had been simmering for years, where distrust had already built walls too high for simple conversation to break through. Officer Carter's hand hovered over his radio, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. He wasn't making any sudden moves, not yet, but his posture, his every motion, seemed to suggest that something was already brewing beneath the surface. The driver's response, calm yet firm, wasn't enough to ease the rising unease. "I'm just asking why you stopped me," the driver said, his voice carrying a mix of confusion and suspicion. "I've done nothing wrong." That's when Officer Carter's tone shifted. "License and registration," he barked, his words colder than before. The driver, still attempting to maintain his composure, reached for his glove compartment, but as his hand moved, it was almost as though time slowed. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what caused the sudden change in atmosphere. Perhaps it was the officer's clenched jaw, the rigid stance. But what was once a routine stop now felt like a powder keg, ready to explode. "Why are you acting like this?" the driver asked again, his voice rising slightly. "I'm just trying to understand what's going on." The officer's eyes narrowed. "I'm doing my job, and you're not helping." In those moments, something shifted, not just between them, but in the very air around them. The tension was palpable. The officer was growing impatient, his patience wearing thin, and the driver, perhaps out of frustration or fear, wasn't backing down. And that's when the first hint of escalation happened. Officer Carter stepped back, his hand resting on the holster of his weapon as if anticipating something more. The driver's heart started to race, his breath catching in his chest. He knew, deep down, that things were about to spiral out of control. But how did it get here? How had something so small, so seemingly insignificant, blown up into a confrontation where the only way out now seemed to be force? The background of their confrontation isn't as simple as it might seem. Carter wasn't just an officer on duty. He had a history in the department, one that many in the community had come to distrust. He had been involved in other incidents, not as extreme as this one, but enough to make people wary of his presence. There were whispers, rumors, maybe, about his approach to certain situations, particularly when dealing with people of color. No one could quite put their finger on it, but the feeling was there. The driver, too, wasn't a stranger to encounters with law enforcement, although never quite like this. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where these types of encounters were common, where the flashing lights of a police car were more than just a nuisance. They were a symbol of something much deeper, something darker. Years of witnessing the fear in his family and friends' eyes whenever an officer was nearby had shaped his own view of the system. It was a view that many shared, one that didn't trust those in power to do what was right. It wasn't just about individual officers, but about a system that seemed to perpetuate injustice in small, insidious ways. As Officer Carter stepped back and signaled to the driver to step out of the vehicle, it was clear that this was no longer just about a traffic violation. It had become personal. The officer's words, harsh and demanding, became a barrier between them, a chasm that only widened as the driver hesitated. What was meant to be a simple exchange was now an unwinnable situation for both of them. The driver, trying to reason, trying to understand the escalation, kept his hands visible. But the more he tried to explain himself, the more he could sense the officer's temper flaring. And in that moment, it wasn't about rights or reasons anymore. It was about power. Who held it? Who was going to control the situation? The silence between their words spoke louder than anything they said. Officer Carter's posture became more rigid, and the air seemed to tighten. The driver, visibly frustrated, had his hand on the door handle, but something held him back. Was it the fear of making the wrong move? of triggering something that would turn the situation deadly? Or was it the knowledge that no matter what, the power dynamic was stacked against him? Then, just like that, without warning, the officer's voice grew louder, harsher. "Step out of the car," he commanded. The words weren't a suggestion anymore. They were a demand. The driver, caught off guard by the sudden shift, was frozen for a split second, trying to make sense of the situation. He had already been so compliant. What more did the officer want from him? What happened next is something that can never be fully explained, only witnessed. The officer's hand shot toward the driver's arm, gripping him tightly. The force with which the officer pulled him out of the car was far more than necessary. In that moment, the driver's breath quickened, panic setting in as he struggled against the officer's firm grip. Was the officer trying to assert control? Was he reacting to the driver's defiance, real or perceived? Or was it simply a decision that spiraled out of the officer's own frustrations, a decision he made in a moment of power? As the officer and the driver grappled, the tension reached a breaking point. The crowd that had gathered in the distance could see what was happening, but they were helpless. The driver was now on the ground, struggling to get free. The officer, towering over him, pressed down with more force. The shouts from the crowd grew louder, but the officer didn't stop. The driver's voice, barely audible, cried out for help. But to whom? The officer's actions had escalated beyond the point of reason. In those brief, terrifying moments, the story of one traffic stop became the story of 1,000 others. It was no longer about one man or one officer. It was about the system, about the power imbalances that shaped every interaction. What happens next? How did the situation de-escalate, or did it? What happens when a moment like this doesn't just fade away, but instead lives on in the hearts of those who witnessed it and those who will never forget? The answers are still coming, and they're not as simple as we would like them to be. The chaos of the moment felt like it was happening in slow motion. The sound of shuffling feet, the heavy breath of both the officer and the driver, and the distant but growing murmurs of the crowd, all blending together into an oppressive noise that threatened to suffocate everyone involved. In those few seconds, the situation had transformed from a simple traffic stop into something far more complex, far more dangerous. But the real question wasn't just about the physical struggle. It was about the layers beneath the surface, the history, the tension, and the inevitable clash between two worlds that had never quite understood each other. The officer's grip tightened as the driver squirmed beneath him, trying to free himself. He wasn't trying to fight back in any violent way. He was simply trying to survive. The officer had the upper hand, but there was something unsettling in the way his movements grew more forceful, more impatient. Was he scared? Was this the result of years of training? Or was there something more instinctive, something deep within him that made him see the driver not as a citizen but as a threat? A threat that needed to be controlled, subdued, broken. From the outside, it was easy for those watching to make quick judgments. They could see the force being applied. They could hear the driver's voice rising, begging for mercy, for restraint. But what about the officer's side of the story? What was going through his mind in those crucial moments? Was he truly just enforcing the law, or was he acting on some deeply ingrained bias that he hadn't even acknowledged? That kind of internal conflict, the one that isn't spoken but constantly lurking beneath the surface, was something that neither the officer nor the driver had the time or space to explore in real time. For the driver, every second felt like a lifetime. He had spent his whole life learning to navigate a world that often didn't see him as fully human. From the way people crossed the street, when he walked down the sidewalk, to the way police officers sometimes treated him, there was always that sense of being on the outside looking in. But this moment, it was different. It wasn't just the fear of being stopped by an officer. It was the overwhelming realization that, in the eyes of this officer, he was a threat. A threat not because of his actions, but because of who he was, because of the color of his skin. He had learned, over the years, how to manage these encounters, how to keep his hands visible, how to speak in the calmest voice possible, how to keep his body language non-threatening. He had spent years perfecting the art of not being seen as a danger. But now, none of that seemed to matter. His heart pounded as he tried to twist his body, trying to break free from the officer's grip, his breath coming in sharp bursts. His mind raced, knowing that one wrong move could change everything. But in the back of his mind, there was another fear, one that went beyond the immediate physical danger. He knew, deep down, that the outcome of this situation was always going to be decided by someone else, and that someone had the power to decide his fate in an instant. For the people watching from the sidelines, the growing sense of helplessness was palpable. Some recorded, some shouted for the officer to stop, but none of them seemed able to break through the moment. Was this just another incident, or was something different happening here? The crowd wasn't simply witnessing an arrest. They were witnessing a life at risk, a story they had heard too many times before, but never quite like this. There were whispers about the officer's history, about the community's strained relationship with the police. Could this be the tipping point? Could this be the moment when everything finally exploded into something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored? The sirens in the distance were growing louder, signaling the arrival of backup. But even as the lights began to flash across the street, the situation wasn't any less volatile. The officer's grip didn't loosen. In fact, it seemed to tighten, as though he was determined to hold control, to impose his authority over the driver, no matter what. And the driver? His fight wasn't just for freedom in that moment. It was a fight for respect, for dignity, for his life. It wasn't lost on him that this moment wasn't just about him and the officer. It was about every encounter he had ever had, every moment when he had been made to feel less than. He had tried, his whole life, to prove that he was more than what people assumed of him. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a threat. He was just a man. But here he was, fighting for that humanity to be recognized, not just by this officer, but by the system that had repeatedly failed him and so many others like him. What people didn't see were the years of trauma, the constant low-level fear that ran through his veins. They didn't see the way he had to prepare himself mentally before every interaction with the police, because it wasn't a matter of if something would go wrong, but when. That kind of weight, that kind of burden, wasn't something he had asked for, but it was something he had to carry every single day. And now, as the officer pressed him harder against the pavement, the driver realized something that terrified him. It didn't matter if he complied. It didn't matter if he stayed calm. In the eyes of this officer, he would always be seen as someone to control, someone to subdue. Meanwhile, the officer's mind wasn't as clear as it appeared. His training had taught him to stay calm, to make decisions quickly, but with precision. But in this moment, he wasn't thinking about training. He wasn't thinking about what was right or wrong. He was thinking about power, about maintaining control in a situation that had already spun beyond his expectations. The driver's resistance, even if it was only an attempt to free himself, felt like a direct challenge. A challenge to his authority, and more personally, to the idea of law enforcement itself. And with each passing second, his actions became more instinctive, less measured. The line between what was acceptable and what was excessive was becoming dangerously blurred. The moment was spiraling, and there was no telling where it would end. Would the arrival of backup change anything, or would it only escalate the situation further? What would happen when the cameras stopped rolling, when the story was told from one side but never quite fully from the other? The questions, the doubts, the fears, none of them had easy answers. And for everyone involved, the only thing that was certain was that nothing would be the same after this moment. And it was only just beginning. The sirens grew louder, but they didn't feel like a relief. If anything, they only added to the mounting sense of dread that hung in the air. The driver's heart pounded faster as he struggled beneath the officer's weight, every breath sharp and ragged. He couldn't think straight anymore. His body was exhausted from trying to free himself, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let the officer win. Not like this. His mind raced, flicking between thoughts of what could happen next, the officer's grip tightening, the sound of handcuffs clicking into place, the distant crowd that was now shouting, urging the officer to stop. But nothing changed. The pressure didn't ease. His body burned with tension, and his mind screamed for him to find a way out. The officer, too, was losing control. His breath was heavy, his hands shaking slightly as they pressed down on the driver, pinning him to the cold pavement. He had always been taught to be firm, to take command of a situation. But this wasn't the kind of stop he had been trained for. It wasn't just the defiance of the driver that made him uneasy. It was the overwhelming sense that the situation had slipped from his control. The crowd was no longer a background noise. It was a presence, a force. They were watching him, their eyes trained on every move, every twitch of his hand. It was about the choice he made in this moment, whether to let his training dictate his actions or to finally step back and acknowledge the humanity of the situation. The sirens, which had blared in the background, now seemed quieter. The noise, the chaos, the fear, it was all beginning to fade into something else. The officer glanced over at the crowd, his eyes scanning their faces. He saw the anger, the distrust, the years of pent-up frustration, and for the first time, he didn't look away. He didn't try to shut it out. It hit him all at once. He was part of the problem. His role in this had been more than just a routine traffic stop. He had added to the fear, the division, the hatred that had been simmering in the community. And now he had to face that. He let out a long, shaky breath, his gaze finally settling on the driver. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, unfinished and unsatisfying, but they were enough to break the tension, just enough for the crowd to exhale. But as the driver's sister moved forward to help her brother, guiding him toward the sidewalk, the story took another unexpected turn. A third squad car, unseen until now, suddenly screeched to a stop behind the officer's car. This one was different. It wasn't filled with uniformed officers, but a group of plainclothes detectives who wasted no time in stepping out all business. They moved swiftly, efficiently, their eyes scanning the scene. The civilian who had intervened, who had seemingly diffused the situation, felt a chill run down his spine. He knew it was coming before anyone else did. One of the detectives approached the officer, his voice low and urgent. "What's going on here?" His eyes flicked to the driver, then to the civilian. His gaze hardened as he took in the situation. "You let him go." The officer swallowed, the weight of the moment heavy on his chest. He couldn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what he should say. Was this over? Could it really be over? But before he could speak, the detective's eyes narrowed. "We need him. He's a witness." The words landed like a bombshell. The driver's sister froze, her breath catching in her throat. The driver, still disoriented, turned to face the detective. "A witness? What are you talking about?" The detective didn't offer an explanation right away. Instead, he stepped toward the civilian, his gaze sharp. "We know who you are," he said, his tone colder now. "And we know you're connected to this." The civilian's face paled. He had been ready to step into the fray, to stop the officer from escalating the situation, but now, it seemed his involvement in this was far from over. He had thought he was helping. He had thought he had diffused the danger. But it seemed that the very moment he'd stepped forward, he had unknowingly made himself a part of something far larger. The driver's confusion deepened. "What's going on?" he asked again, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "Why are you dragging me into this?" The detective ignored him, his focus entirely on the civilian. "You're going to have to come with us. Both of you." The air felt heavy again, the streets suddenly smaller. The crowd, still restless, watched in confusion as the situation took another unexpected turn. What had started as a seemingly random encounter was now spiraling into something much more complex, and none of them had any idea where it would end. The officer, who had begun to believe he was finally free of the weight of his actions, stood in stunned silence. His apology, his moment of clarity, now seemed almost irrelevant. The case, a story, wasn't about him anymore. He wasn't the one in control. The real story was just beginning to unfold. The tension in the air was palpable, and as the detective's words sank in, the crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. The officer, still processing the sudden shift in his role, stepped back, his face pale and unsure. He had thought his involvement in the situation was over, that his actions would be the end of it. But now, with the detective's arrival, it became clear that the real story was far from finished. The civilian, still standing in the center of the chaos, looked between the detective and the driver. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. He had come to help, to prevent further escalation, but now it seemed like he was about to be dragged into something far more complex than he had anticipated. The driver's sister, equally stunned, took a step forward. The sirens screamed closer, but still, nothing was certain. Just as the officer's grip loosened slightly, a crackling noise interrupted the tense silence, followed by the sudden blare of another siren, a different sound, a warning. The first squad car, which had been rushing toward the scene, swerved sharply as a second police vehicle appeared around the corner. It wasn't just a backup unit. It was a response team, the kind reserved for situations deemed high risk. The moment the new vehicle screeched to a stop, everything shifted. The air, thick with tension, seemed to snap taut, like the final strands of a rope about to snap. The crowd, which had been shouting, watching in anticipation, suddenly fell silent. The new officers didn't hesitate. They knew the drill, immediately springing into action, focused only on one thing: neutralizing any threat. The shift was immediate and disorienting. The crowd's jeers turned to gasps as the situation escalated further, just as the officer who had initially detained the driver began to feel his own tension rise. The arrival of these reinforcements had thrown him off balance. He had been in control, or at least he thought he was. But now, everything was slipping away. For the driver, the arrival of more officers felt like a cruel twist of fate. The second squad car had arrived with a blinding flash of lights and a barrage of chaotic movement, and now he was surrounded. He had barely had a moment to process the officer's hesitation before the situation erupted again, now threatening to spiral completely out of his hands. The officers, unaware of what had unfolded in the seconds before, took no time to assess the situation. They just moved in, fast, aggressive, almost robotic. "Get down," one of the new officers barked as he rushed toward the driver, pushing his foot against the driver's back with force, the boot digging painfully into his spine. The crowd shouted, a mix of confusion and fear echoing across the street. Some people were trying to reason with the officers, others yelling, demanding answers. But none of it mattered. The officers didn't stop. They didn't slow. The tension only seemed to rise with every movement, every second that passed. The situation had become a battlefield in real time. And in the middle of it all, the driver struggled, fighting not just for his freedom, but for something bigger, for his life, for his dignity, for the right to be treated as a person. But just as the situation seemed ready to reach a boiling point, an unexpected twist unfolded. From the back of the crowd, someone screamed. The voice was unmistakable, filled with urgency and fear, but it wasn't a bystander. It was a woman the driver recognized. She was his sister. "Stop, please, he didn't do anything." Her voice cracked as she pushed through the crowd, moving toward the officers, her hands raised, trying to diffuse the escalating tension. The driver's heart skipped a beat as he realized what was happening. His sister had always been there in his life, always trying to protect him from the very things that seemed inevitable. And now here she was, walking straight into a situation that was growing more volatile with every second. Her presence only added to the confusion. The officers, already on edge, shifted their attention, their eyes darting toward her, but they didn't break their stance. "Stay back, ma'am," one of the officers shouted, but she didn't listen. Her voice grew louder, more desperate, as she stepped closer to the officers, ignoring their commands. "Please, he's my brother. He's not a criminal. You're hurting him." Her words hung in the air, a sudden shift that caught everyone off guard. The crowd watched as her face, filled with panic and resolve, came into full view. Some people whispered her name. Others recognized her from around the community, a local activist who had spoken out against police overreach more times than anyone could count. For a moment, There was a brief pause in the chaos. The officers, now distracted, shifted their gaze between her and the driver. The shift in focus, however small, was enough for the driver to catch his breath. But the brief moment of hope quickly dissolved as the officer who had initially pinned him down, his face twisted with frustration, barked another command. "I'm not going anywhere," the driver said, his voice low but steady. His words were a declaration, a promise. It wasn't just to the officer or to the crowd. It was to himself. He wouldn't let this moment define him. The officer's lips pressed into a thin line, his face betraying nothing. He had been prepared to escalate, to enforce his control. He had been ready for the situation to devolve into something far more dangerous. But now he stood at the crossroads of decision. It was clear to him, as it was to everyone watching, that this wasn't about power or authority anymore. It wasn't about him at all. It was about the choice he made in this moment, whether to let his training dictate his actions or to finally step back and acknowledge the humanity of the situation. The sirens, which had blared in the background, now seemed quieter. The noise, the chaos, the fear, it was all beginning to fade into something else. The officer glanced over at the crowd, his eyes scanning their faces. He saw the anger, the distrust, the years of pent-up frustration, and for the first time, he didn't look away. He didn't try to shut it out. It hit him all at once. He was part of the problem. His role in this had been more than just a routine traffic stop. He had added to the fear, the division, the hatred that had been simmering in the community. And now he had to face that. He let out a long, shaky breath, his gaze finally settling on the driver. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, unfinished and unsatisfying, but they were enough to break the tension, just enough for the crowd to exhale. But as the driver's sister moved forward to help her brother, guiding him toward the sidewalk, the story took another unexpected turn. A third squad car, unseen until now, suddenly screeched to a stop behind the officer's car. This one was different. It wasn't filled with uniformed officers, but a group of plainclothes detectives who wasted no time in stepping out, all business. They moved swiftly, efficiently, their eyes scanning the scene. The civilian who had intervened, who had seemingly diffused the situation, felt a chill run down his spine. He knew it was coming before anyone else did. One of the detectives approached the officer, his voice low and urgent. "What's going on here?" His eyes flicked to the driver, then to the civilian. His gaze hardened as he took in the situation. "You let him go." The officer swallowed, the weight of the moment heavy on his chest. He couldn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what he should say. Was this over? Could it really be over? But before he could speak, the detective's eyes narrowed. "We need him. He's a witness." The words landed like a bombshell. The driver's sister froze, her breath catching in her throat. The driver, still disoriented, turned to face the detective. "A witness? What are you talking about?" The detective didn't offer an explanation right away. Instead, he stepped toward the civilian, his gaze sharp. "We know who you are," he said, his tone colder now. "And we know you're connected to this." The civilian's face paled. He had been ready to step into the fray, to stop the officer from escalating the situation, but now, it seemed his involvement in this was far from over. He had thought he was helping. He had thought he had diffused the danger. But it seemed that the very moment he'd stepped forward, he had unknowingly made himself a part of something far larger. The driver's confusion deepened. "What's going on?" he asked again, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "Why are you dragging me into this?" The detective ignored him, his focus entirely on the civilian. "You're going to have to come with us. Both of you." The air felt heavy again, the streets suddenly smaller. The crowd, still restless, watched in confusion as the situation took another unexpected turn. What had started as a seemingly random encounter was now spiraling into something much more complex, and none of them had any idea where it would end. The officer, who had begun to believe he was finally free of the weight of his actions, stood in stunned silence. His apology, his moment of clarity, now seemed almost irrelevant. The case, a story, wasn't about him anymore. He wasn't the one in control. The real story was just beginning to unfold. The tension in the air was palpable, and as the detective's words sank in, the crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. The officer, still processing the sudden shift in his role, stepped back, his face pale and unsure. He had thought his involvement in the situation was over, that his actions would be the end of it. But now, with the detective's arrival, it became clear that the real story was far from finished. The civilian, still standing in the center of the chaos, looked between the detective and the driver. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. He had come to help, to prevent further escalation, but now it seemed like he was about to be dragged into something far more complex than he had anticipated. The driver's sister, equally stunned, took a step forward. "What's going on? Why are you bringing him into this?" she asked, her voice a mix of fear and confusion. The detective didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned toward the officers who had been on the scene earlier, the ones who had tried to detain the driver. They stood silently, as though waiting for confirmation. One of the officers nodded, confirming the story the detectives were about to unfold. The tension in the air thickened again, but this time it was different. It wasn't about the officers or the crowd. It was about the truth, and the truth was far murkier than anyone had expected. "Your brother," the detective began, addressing the sister, his voice sharp but steady. "He's a witness to a crime. We were looking for him, and we've been monitoring his movements for some time." The sister's expression shifted from fear to disbelief. "What crime? My brother hasn't done anything wrong," she exclaimed, stepping closer to the detective. Her eyes darted between him and her brother, trying to make sense of the situation. The detective held up a hand, trying to calm her down. "Listen, ma'am. We've been tracking someone involved in a major robbery ring in the area. We have reason to believe your brother might have witnessed something crucial, something that could help us with the investigation." The crowd, sensing the turn in the story, murmured quietly. The officers, still standing at the edge of the scene, seemed uncomfortable, unsure of what their next move should be. The civilian, who had tried to intervene just moments before, now felt a heavy weight in his chest. This was bigger than he had thought. He had no idea the driver, the person he had tried to protect, was connected to something like this. "But why not just tell us this earlier?" the driver's sister demanded, her voice rising with frustration. "Why all this brutality? Why not just explain from the beginning?" The detective didn't answer right away. He seemed to take a moment to assess the situation before speaking, his voice now quieter but filled with resolve. "The information we received was vague. We couldn't risk alarming anyone, especially if we were wrong about the connection. Sometimes the pressure of the moment gets to us, and we make decisions that seem harsh. But we're here to solve this, not to hurt anyone." The driver, still standing with his hands bound, felt his heart race. The revelation was a shock, but it wasn't the full story. There was something missing. He wasn't just a bystander. He had been a part of something without realizing it, and now it seemed he was trapped in a situation where his fate was being decided by forces he didn't fully understand. The knot in his stomach tightened, and the fear that had been simmering throughout the entire encounter began to rear its head again. "Are you saying that you thought I was involved?" he asked, his voice shaky, still trying to make sense of the situation. The detective nodded slowly. "We had to consider every possibility. It wasn't about you specifically. It was about the connections. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and we had reason to believe you might be involved, especially with how the situation unfolded tonight." The realization hit him like a cold wave. He wasn't a victim of excessive force. He had become part of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that was still missing pieces. His confusion, his frustration, all of it seemed justified now. But that didn't mean the officers' actions were excusable. They had acted without all the facts, without considering the consequences of their approach. The civilian had been right to intervene, and the officer had been wrong to escalate. As the conversation between the detectives and the driver's family continued, the crowd began to disperse slowly, each person processing what had just transpired in their own way. The anger that had once filled the street had begun to fade, but there was something else left in its wake, something deeper, more unresolved. The police had acted on assumptions, on their own biases. They hadn't waited to understand the situation before jumping to conclusions, and in doing so, they had escalated an already fragile situation. But as the night wore on, the detectives' words began to sink in. The driver wasn't guilty of the crime they had suspected, but his testimony would be crucial to the case. He had witnessed something important that could help bring justice, and that, in the end, made the entire incident a turning point. The driver would have to speak up, to give his side of the story, to clear his name. It wasn't over yet, but this was a chance for him to make a difference. The detective turned to the driver, his demeanor shifting to one of professionalism once again. "We're going to take you down to the station, get your statement. After that, you'll be free to go, but we need your help. We can't do this without you." The driver nodded slowly, his mind racing. He had gone from being the one in danger, the one wronged by the system, to someone who might hold the key to solving something much bigger than himself. His role had shifted, and with it, his perspective. And in that moment, the driver knew that this was far from the end. There would be more battles to fight. There would be more questions to answer. But at least now, the truth was beginning to surface, and that was the first step towards something better. As the police car pulled away, with the driver and his sister inside, the crowd had mostly disappeared, leaving behind only the lingering echoes of a night that had started with fear and ended with possibility. The uncertainty that had gripped the streets had not vanished entirely, but now there was a chance for resolution, a chance for justice. And the lessons learned from the night, about the power of assumptions, about the need for understanding, about the importance of standing up and speaking out, would not be forgotten. The city would change, slowly, but it would change, and the driver, for all he had endured, would play his part in that change.